Hi, Cheryl back again to show you how to sew on binding. Now this works for bias binding or straight cut binding, either one, same technique. Now one of the things you want to think about is your quilt is thick now because it has the 3 layers, top, batting, and backing. And because of that thickness, it makes it a little difficult for your machine to stitch through all those layers and not shift things around. So one of the things they have for your machine is called a dual feed presser. And I have mine on my machine right now. They look different, but usually they're pretty big like this. And as you can see, it's got this little clip here that fits over your thread uptake lever. You always, excuse me, want to make sure that that's on this pin that sticks out. Very important when you're installing it. Now I'm going to set the camera up and flip it around so you can see my sewing machine from here. And oops, no, flipped it the wrong way. All right, here we go. Oh goodness, I think I need to go eat dinner. Anyway, so here we are zoomed in, and here's my piece that we're going to be sewing the binding onto. Now what you want to do is leave a tail at the end, because when you get to the end you're going to overlap. And because this is so small, I'm going to start way down here to start sewing this on. Now you could put a clip there to hold it to remind you to stitch that far, and sometimes I'll put a clip on the other end as well to remind me to stop at that point. So what you do here is one of the few times in quilting you do back stitch this. You also want to make sure that you know where 1/4 of an inch is on your dual feed foot, because that will make a difference also. As I said, I'm going to start way up here so that there's plenty of room for turning this. So you're just going to lay that on top like that. I'm going to take one of my clips out. So as you can see, hopefully, nope. As you can see, I have my binding up here on my vertical spool pin, and then my thread is coming out here. So it just makes it a little bit easier to manage, especially when you're doing a fairly big quilt. So now let's get you set back up here so you can see what I'm doing. So we're already pretty close to the end here that we have to do our mitered corner. And so let me make sure I have my pins, because the first thing you want to do as you're approaching your corner, and not before, because you don't want to lose the pin for one thing, is measure this, and you're going to mark 1/4 of an inch. And this measure again is one of my favorite tools, and use it a lot for things. And you're going to just mark where that corner ends at 1/4 of an inch with a pin, so that you know that's where your corner is going to turn. So we'll put that in there just like that. So then we're going to, as I said, we're going to stitch. I always stitch forward a couple of stitches and then back stitch a couple stitches. That just reinforces it, because there will be some tugging on it when you're matching up your ends, lining up with where I know is 1/4 of an inch on my dual feed foot. So now I'm just going to sew down, and your stitch length should be at 2 or 2.0, and because you want this to hold really well. Now the nice thing about this is as we approach the pin, there's lines on this foot so that you know, because once the pin goes up underneath that presser foot, you can't really tell if you're on it or not. But because there's a line on there, I can see that I'm right on that pin. So now we're going to take that pin out. You're going to raise your presser foot, and you're going to turn this diagonally and sew off that corner. Now when I do it, I actually like to back stitch this because it is going to be trimmed. So I find that that just holds it a little bit better, and just do a couple stitches and then I stitch off the end. Then what you want to do, and this is my technique, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but this is what I found works for me. So if you don't like this method, I would go on the internet and start searching for how to do mitered corners on a quilt, because there are a bunch of different ways out there. So one of the things you want to make sure is this is not getting up underneath your quilt at all. You don't want your tail caught in. So now you have this angle here. So what you're going to do is fold your fabric like this, forming your mitered corner. Very simple to do. And what I usually do is pin it here to hold it. I've also found it's actually really helpful to pin it this way, and I do it from the outside in just because my pin heads can sometimes get in the way of things. And then I'll usually pin it a couple spots further down just to hold it in place. Now you're ready to finish and go ahead and do your next side. And again on this, I'm going to backstitch just because I'm OCD about that, and I like to make sure that my corners are well reinforced. So I sew forward a few stitches, but then I'm backstitching and then going forward. Then I take that pin out so it doesn't get lost. And when we get to that pin, we'll take it out. And then when you're applying your bias, just have it on there. You don't want to tug on it so much, but lay it on there firmly. And if that makes any sense. So, because if it's too loose, you're going to get bubbles. And if it's too tight, you're going to get pulls. So you don't want either one of those to happen. So it's kind of a feel for it, but it's pretty easy. Now, when I got here, I'm right on a seam. Now, what you can do, at least for the first seam, is make sure that that's not going to hit on a corner. I didn't bother doing that, so the other thing you can do, and I won't do it on this because it's a sample, is you actually can redo this seam, take it off your machine, redo this seam and move that seam up a ways. Once you do that, then and repress it, then you'll have you won't have your seam on the corner. So when I don't do that, I found that it still lays really nicely. I haven't ever had a problem with it. Sometimes I'll cut it off and play with it. It kind of depends on the piece. In this case, I'm not going to do that. So then again, we want to measure the 1/4 inch, mark it with your pin, and it doesn't matter if you do actually sew over this a little bit because it's so thick at that point. Even if you have thick pins, it's not going to hurt your sewing machine needle. So here we are approaching our pin, and again I'm going to look over on this side here to see when that pin is on the mark for where the needle is. Raise the presser foot, turn, I guess that's a 45-degree angle. So off the corner. Now if you have my bias, if you have which we did on our quilt, we had mitered corners on our borders. And so one of the things you also want to do is try to get this seam so that it's on your seam from your mitered border. So I didn't have that in the sample, but it's something you want to pay attention to as you're stitching. And it's easy to see that. And you can actually see as you pin it where that seam comes up. So that makes it pretty easy. So again, we're going to fold that up like that. And you can see it's not really getting impacted by the seam being in it. It's a little thicker, but not too big a deal. All right, so pin here. And then another pin up here. And we are ready to sew down this side. So again, you're going to back stitch. And what I usually do is, as I cut the threads off, like here, I'll clip that corner off. That just gets rid of some of the bulk. Just make sure that you don't cut into your seam that you made here. That helps with how much bulk you have. So now we're at the end of this. Mine's really short, so I don't have a lot of pins. And of course I pulled that away, but it's fine. And now we're ready to stitch down this side. And now I'm going to pause it and finish up sewing it, and then I'll show you how to do the ends. So I'm back. I've gotten my binding put on all 4 edges, and I'm ready to show you how to do your ends. Now, one of the things I think I possibly neglected to talk about was squaring up your quilt before you do this. And you do want to do that. And also, on my sample, the quilting doesn't go all the way to the edges, but of course on your quilt, it goes all the way to the edges. What I usually do is square it up based on the width of the borders, because I tend to always do borders. So I'll lay my ruler along the seam of the outside border and trim it to match that. Cutting off, if you leave a little bit of an edge that's not your top and bottom fabric, but or would be your bottom fabric, but not your top fabric, that's okay, but not too much. And so in general, you want to see what this kind of the smallest edge would be. A lot of times quilts are not exactly square at this point because of the quilting process. It's hard to keep them really square. So you just want to work on that and try to get it so it looks as square as possible. I also will tend to look at the ends, measure the ends together. Basically, in this case with my little sample, if I put my 2 edges together, we see that these 2 edges match, and you can do it also with the other edges. Now, this batting I used is actually really thick, so, you know, depending on your batting, how easy it is to do that. So let's switch around to the cutting table. And now we have these 2 tails. Let's get rid of the pins so they're not in the way. So I have these 2 tails. I usually put the seam at the bottom because it's also going to be bias. It doesn't matter, but just to let you know, this one happens to turn out at the top. This is actually a quilting design I was testing to see what I thought about doing some of my own quilting. We'll see if that ever happens. So now I left a nice big opening here. Let's make sure you can see this. One of the things you do want to do before you get to this point, though, is take it to the ironing board and press it so that it's pressed out. Actually, you could wait to do this till afterwards, but that way you can see what you have here. And just make sure that's smooth. Anyway, we'll do that again later. I go out of order sometimes. What can I tell you? So we have these 2 long ends. Now, what do we do with these? So we basically want them sewn together on the diagonal. And that gets a little bit tricky to do. So usually what I'll do is say, okay, I have this much space, figure out about the middle of that. And I'm going to just cut this first one off. So it falls to there. Then I am going to make sure that's out nice and flat, and I am going to put a pin here. I'm not pinning it down, but just marking where that end is, because to hold it down, you'd have to go in a ways. But that's just to mark where that end is. And then I'm going to lay this out, and our binding is 2 1/4. So you want to add 1/2 inch. No, I'm sorry. You want to add 1/4 inch to make it 2 1/2. And then you're going to mark that on your top one. So I line this pin up here with the 2 1/2 mark. And then I'm going to put another pin over here at the end and just pin it through this one. And then I'm going to lay it back out just to make sure. I can see already the pin's not straight. Just to make sure that's 2 1/2. And because sometimes the pin will slip a little bit or whatever. And yeah, that looks pretty darn good, 2 1/2. And then what we're going to do is take our ruler and we're going to trim that off right where that pin is, lining up your edge with the binding so that it's nice and square. And we're going to cut that off. And then you have binding left over. That's typical. I have a whole bin of leftover binding. All right, so now, how do we do this? We could take this pin out now. So basically what you need to do is keeping right sides together. You're going to fold this up a little bit just to give you some play. And then once your seams are together, then you're going to turn one so that you now have your ends going together like that. And what you want to do is offset them about 1/8 of an inch each. That way you can see where your little corners are that you have to go into. And I'll usually, actually I always pin it, one pin on either side of that fold so that I can test it and make sure I have it turned correctly, because it's a little tricky and sometimes you can get it so it's twisted. Oh, look, I did it right the first time. So now you can see that I have my diagonal line here. Hopefully you can see that. And now what we're going to do is go, and this is small, so it's a little harder to work with for this. We're going to lay the ruler on there, and we're going to cut off about 1/4 of an inch seam, just because we don't need all that there. Now, one of the other ways to do it is you could put pins out here and even in here to hold it in place. And then what you could do is take these pins out and take your fabric marker and draw that line in. And that makes it really easy to see where it's going to get sewn. So you're going from that V to this V. So you're going to draw that line. Hopefully we'll be able to see it with this purple. It's the first one I grabbed. Now the pin is kind of pushing it up, so you want to be careful it's not, oh look, it does show very nicely. Good. All right. Then I'll just put my pins back in just to hold it so the bottom doesn't slip around. And then we take this to the sewing machine, scoot on over there, and we're just going to sew that seam. Now I could have cut it off beforehand, afterwards, doesn't really matter which. It also doesn't matter that you have your walking foot on. It's also called, it's dual feed, it's also called a walking foot. I knew there was 2 names for it and I couldn't think of that until just now. So, because it helps your machine walk. So So we're going to get everything lined up. We're going to go right here to that intersection there on that bottom of the V, and we're just going to go following our line that we have, making it easy to see. We're just going to stitch that down. Now at this point, we could take it back over to the cutting board and trim that off, but since this is just a sample, I'm not going to worry about that. I will cut my threads though. And then I'm just going to trim that off at about 1/4 inch. A little bit more probably. And that's okay. Now, the next step is, you can see that lays nice and flat. It's okay if it's a little bit tight. It's actually not bad. And sometimes, depending on how big your opening is, I'll actually put some clips there to hold it in place. Maybe that one more to hold it there where that intersection is. And I'm going to trim that off a little bit better because we don't want that bulk inside of our binding. All right, so we'll put another clip there to hold it, making sure that you have your bottom layer caught. Sometimes it'll get folded up, so you want to make sure you're getting your bottom layer in on all of this, actually, of course. All right, so then we're just going to line back up with where we ended up here, put our presser foot down, and away we go. Stitch this down. And get down to where our other stitching is, and just go over it a ways, and you're done with that step of your binding. Now, if you're doing it by machine for both ways, you'd be on your back of your, oh, you can see I actually got a little tuck there. Won't worry about that now. But if this was the back of your quilt, turn you a little bit. If this was the back, then when you flip it to the front and press it down, you can see it fits quite nicely. And then what you can use, I tend to use like a serpentine stitch, which holds really nicely. That kind of, and then you don't have to worry about sewing it perfectly straight, which works out really well. So that's the only difference if you wanted to do it by machine. Since we're doing it by stitch down by hand, our binding is on the front, flip to the back. So now we're going to go to the cutting, no, this is the ironing board. And we're going to, yes, you can see me. We're going to press this out. Now, your mitered corners, obviously you can't press out that well. But you just press into those corners and just make sure this is out nicely. Now this batting, because it's thick, if this were a real quilt, I probably would have used 2.5 inch. So if you have fat batting that you're using, which is somewhat rare these days, but if you do, you may want to do 2.5 width for your binding. Now it's all pressed, ready to go. So now what you're going to do is flip it over. Ignore my stitching on here. Again, it was practice to learn how to do quilting. And I'll start with one of the corners usually. To do your corner, put a clip there, and you're going to make that into a miter. So that's pushing that in and pushing that down to form your miter right there like that. And I find just putting a clip right there on the corner helps hold it in place. And depending on how big your quilt is and how many clips you have, sometimes I'll just clip part of it if I'm running out of clips, if it's something big. Although usually if it's a big one, I do it by machine. So, and you're going to pull this down nice and tight so it's laying smoothly on this side. And then you're just going to use a running stitch. No, it's not a running stitch. What is that stitch called? But basically, you're going to go under on your backing side and then come up on your top side. And let me find a needle and thread. And I'll show you how to do that real quick. I happen to have a needle here. Oh, with some white thread even. Look at that. Not much, but a little bit. All right. So now when I'm sewing binding on, one of the things I found happening, well, I always use a thimble when I sew by hand, which goes on your middle finger. So that's where your thimble would go. But then I found that I was really hurting my these two fingers, because even though you have a thimble on to push it, there's still some pulling involved. So what I did was took some silicone finger covers that are for when you're ironing so that you don't burn yourself, and just use those, and that protects my fingers, especially since I got this big old blister on here, or bruise. Protects your fingers so that you can stitch by hand. Now, when you're stitching by hand, actually, let me use the other color thread so that you see what I'm doing. So you do a single thick thread, and what you want to do is hold your thread like this, wrap it around your finger, and just roll it off, and then pull it down into the end, and that'll form your knot. If you have a little tail, you can always trim that off. And then I always do a few stitches at the beginning right in one place to hold it down. And I'll do that periodically, usually when I hit an intersection or when I get to a corner. I'll do some extra stitches just to reinforce it. So a couple extra stitches there, pull it nice and tight, and it should cover your stitching from where you stitched your binding on. Now what you want to do is go under here and then up there. We're not too close to the edge, but kind of close to the edge. Maybe in about a 1/16 or so. And pull that tight so it's not loose. And that's your stitch you use to stitch it down. Now, some people do actually flip it around the other way. I cannot do it that way, so I cannot show you that way. But some people actually stitch it this way and go that way on it. But I found this works best for me, so figure out what works best for you. But you want to go, and I do kind of small stitches because you want to make sure this is going to hold. So about that long. You can see from my blue thread on there that I'm not going very far. Maybe a fat 1/4 of an inch is all. And just keep going all the way around. Now again, when you get to the corner, let me get that settled. When you get to the corner, so here's one that's clipped, you're going to stitch, 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 then do a few stitches here. Now, if you're entering this in a fair, or you think it might get a lot of wear and tear, and what they tell you the best way to do it is to stitch up here and down this side, and then come back through and continue with your stitching. Normally, I don't do that, but yes, if you ever enter something in the fair, you always want to do that. You also want to make sure that this is pulled nice and tight so that your binding is filled. It's what it's called. If it's not, and you enter it in the fair, it gets you basically, you're not going to win a ribbon, because they just, say, nope, nothing for this person because their binding's not filled. First thing they look for when they're judging quilts. So, and also make sure as you're doing this that this is all tucked in nice and flat. Because sometimes when you press it on one side, then this part starts slipping out. So you don't want that to happen. So that basically, let's flip us around. That's basically how you do binding. And again, let me know if you have any questions as usual.